Boris Johnson has announced that the UK and the EU have struck a new Brexit agreement. Writing on Twitter, the Prime Minister said, "We've got a great new deal that takes back control. Now Parliament should get Brexit done on Saturday so we can move on to other priorities." Well, the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, has said it was a fair and balanced agreement for the EU and the UK. However, the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, whose 10 votes the government might need to get the deal approved in the House of Commons, have said in response that they remain opposed to the deal. But what's in the agreement? Well, first, to avoid a hard border, Northern Ireland will remain aligned to a set of rules related to the EU's single market. The agreement says negotiators have found a way to avoid a customs border on the island of Ireland while ensuring that Northern Ireland remains a part of the UK customs territory. And members of the Northern Ireland Assembly, they will have a say on the long-term application of EU law in Northern Ireland. The EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has welcomed this deal. He said it will protect the peace process, offer Northern Ireland's politician a say over the new arrangements every 4 years, and lead to a future free trade agreement between the UK and the EU. Mr Barnier said he has faith in Boris Johnson to get MPs to approve the deal, which he admitted had been hard to achieve.
I am a political man, and I can well imagine that the Prime Minister, who is also a politician, believes that when he said to President Juncker this morning, I was part of this phone call where we approved the agreement that was reached last night, has faith in his ability to convince the majority he needs in the House of Commons. That's all I can say. He said that based on this agreement and the explanations he intends to give, that he has confidence in his ability to win that vote.
Michel Barnier just speaking a few moments ago in a building right beside this one that I'm speaking to you in. Let us turn to our assistant political editor, Norman Smith, who has a lot to say on this issue, and some guests with him as well. Norman.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, they may have a deal in Brussels. Boris Johnson may think he has a deal, but here at Westminster, a deal is very far from concluded because the DUP say they are still unhappy. And without their 10 votes, most people here think it's very hard to see how Mr Johnson can get his agreement through the Commons. Well, joining me is the Lib Dem leader, Jo Swinson. And what prospect do you think has Mr Johnson of getting a majority on Saturday for his package?
Well, we don't even think that there's going to be legal text put in front of the House of Commons on Saturday because the Prime Minister has been so laid back about trying to even do this negotiation. What is coming out of Brussels is that he's actually managed to negotiate something that is even worse for our economy than what Theresa May had put forward. We're talking about an act of economic vandalism which would be worse for the economy than the financial crash. And people know what that is going to do to jobs, to the amount of money they have in their pockets, and that is not good for our country. That's why the public need to have the final say. So however Boris Johnson tries to dress this up, Liberal Democrats are going to be arguing very passionately to make sure that the choice is given to the public to have the final say with the chance to remain in the European Union.
OK, so do you want Saturday's vote to go ahead?
I'm very happy for the House of Commons to sit on Saturday. We are in a moment where there is a huge crisis with the 31st of October deadline, and Parliament absolutely should be holding the government to account. So I'm very happy for us to sit on Saturday. Of course, having a detailed discussion on something which is we still have not seen the legal text for, and we still may not by Saturday. That isn't actually a full deal. So yes, we should sit. We should hold the government to account, and of course, it's important that Parliament is able to put forward what its views are on this as well, on behalf of the millions of people in this country who are genuinely very worried about what this will mean for public services, what this will mean for their jobs, what this will mean for their children's futures.
We hear that Mr Johnson is going to say to EU leaders, we've got a deal, now I want you to rule out the option of any further extension.
I mean, that's just him trying to bounce the country and force the country into this. You know, we're talking about generations to come. This is a hugely important moment in our country's history, and we need to get this right, and yet he's trying to rush it through. And people need to be able to see the detail, they need to be able to discuss it and decide whether or not that's the right thing. As a Liberal Democrat, I'm absolutely clear the best deal that we could have is as members of the European Union, but there's many MPs that are going to want to look at this critically, and many of them who have supported Theresa May's deal are also worried about the additional hit to the economy that this would bring forward. So those debates need to happen, and trying to say, you know, it's this or you crash out with no deal, you know, is frankly a kind of bouncing the country, which he shouldn't be playing that game.
We learned this morning that the Labour Party seem poised to back an amendment if it's tabled to Mr Johnson's deal, if it's brought on Saturday for a so-called confirmatory referendum. Now, that has always been lost in previous votes. How do you assess the prospect of it succeeding if it's tabled again?
I think it's certainly possible, and of course as Liberal Democrats we have tabled an amendment to the Queen's speech which suggests that there should be a people's vote on any Brexit deal, and whether that's the Theresa May deal, if that's the latest one, or whether indeed Boris Johnson manages to have a legally agreed deal, that should be put to the public for the final say. At the last indicative vote in March, that got 280 votes in the House of Commons, so it was pretty popular, but it didn't get a majority. So we've since then seen MPs like Oliver Letwin and others of the Rebel Conservative group say that they would be prepared, if necessary, to have a public final say on the deal. So I think it is entirely possible that that could get over the line, and it's something Liberal Democrats have been arguing for 3 and a bit years, because we've always said that the decision should rest with the public, not just about the initial decision that was taken in 2016, but then to say, now that you know what it looks like, you should be able to choose.
And just clarify, what is your assessment of what is going on? Because we have the DUP saying they're still not on board. We have Boris Johnson saying it's a done deal. So how do you assess what Mr Johnson is doing, and is there any scope, do you think, for him to get the DUP on board?
My best assessment of what's going on is that this is a case of emperor's new clothes. Boris Johnson is in a desperate situation, and you know, he's made these rash promises trying to suggest that it was going to be easy to square the circle, and instead he's found many of the same challenges that Theresa May found. So he's come back with something which is a bit like Theresa May's deal, but is a harder Brexit, going to be worse for the economy, and instead he's dressing it up and saying, oh, isn't this sparkling and great? It's emperor's new clothes. It's the same old damage to the economy, it's the same old things that Theresa May was putting forward largely, and he's trying to just say that this is in some way different as a sort of roll of the dice to see whether he can pull the wool over the eyes of the DUP and people in the country. And I don't think people are going to be fooled by this.
Okay, Jo Swinson, thanks very much for your time. So huge uncertainty here at Westminster at how this plays out over the next 48 hours or so, whether Mr Johnson can get the DUP on board. If he can't, the risks of having that vote on Saturday facing possible defeat, and if that vote goes ahead, is there the possibility that MPs would have the numbers to force a confirmatory referendum on any deal? So a huge amount to play for over the next 48 hours.
Thank you so much, Norman. So interesting also to hear the thoughts of Jo Swinson there with you. And we're going to be going back to Norman periodically, who's there in Westminster for us. You're here instead at the European Council, 27 leaders making their way probably in the next hour or so, and then having a roundtable meeting at 3:30. But as you've been hearing, there is a deal that has been agreed by both the UK and the EU. Why don't we pick it apart a little bit with Reality Check's correspondent Chris Morris, who joins me. Chris, great to have you with us. You've been taking a look throughout the morning with us at the 60 pages that have been released that Boris Johnson is tweeting very happily about. Also, we have the chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, also saying that this is a great deal. He feels his work is done. But the work doesn't end here.
It doesn't end here, no. I mean, obviously, most of the change is to do with the issue which has become the most difficult issue in the entire progress, the Irish border. and the way that's going to work after Brexit. So a lot of it is rewriting the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, which is a bit about Ireland in the withdrawal agreement, which included what became known as the backstop. Now, in this new Boris Johnson deal, the backstop has gone. What replaces it, though, is something which both Conservative politicians and the DUP in Northern Ireland have said in the past they would never accept, which is de facto a border in the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and Great Britain for both customs checks and regulatory checks on goods. Now, obviously the proviso to that, and this is going to be key for many Conservatives, is that Article 4 of this new protocol says Northern Ireland is part of the customs territory of the United Kingdom. In other words, even though the legal border will be, the practical border will be down the Irish Sea, the legal border will be between Northern Ireland and Ireland. So Northern Ireland will leave the EU customs union under the terms of this deal along with the rest of the UK, which critically for many Tories means that Northern Ireland will be able to take a full part in any free trade agreements that the government subsequently does with other countries around the world. The other issue which is problematic and has been problematic with the Democratic Unionist Party, whose votes, of course, as we know, Boris Johnson really needs in the House of Commons, is the issue of consent. If Northern Ireland's economic relationship with the rest of the UK is going to change, how do you win democratic approval for that? And the DUP wanted essentially to have a veto on that process, but what this document lays out is that that 4 years after the end of a transition period, in other words, in 2024 it would be in effect, there would be a simple majority vote in the Northern Ireland Assembly. So neither community, unionist or nationalist, would necessarily have a veto over that process. And that's another thing they're clearly unhappy about.
So that would be 5 years down the line, Chris, that we could still be looking at a situation not that different to where we are right now. Chris Morris, the BBC's Reality Check, thank you so much for giving us some of that analysis.